I'm going where there's no depression, to the lovely land that's free from care. I'll leave this world of toil and trouble. My home's in heaven, I'm going there.
The Great Depression came in waves. I won't discuss the causes of the Depression itself, because this is a video about music, and at the end of the day, why the end of the world happens is irrelevant. What happens after the end of the world is a far more important question. The Wall Street crash of 1929 is generally accepted as the beginning of the Depression. Now, it's important to recognize that an economy is not simply the stock market, and that recovery is rarely a linear process, even in economics. While there was an initial optimism in the stock market's ability to recover naturally from the crash, the Dow Jones even returning to pre-depression levels in early 1930, that hope was soon dashed as the stock market continued to decline rapidly, reaching a low point of just 41 in 1932. Meanwhile, in that same time frame, industrial production in the U.S. dropped by about 46%, and unemployment rose by a whopping 607%. Now, these early years would spell the worst economic downturn of the entire Depression, but the later years of the Depression would become immortalized in song. Herbert Hoover's response to the Depression was ultimately unsuccessful. Favoring indirect relief, Hoover refused to give federal aid to citizens directly. He attempted to convince Americans that direct monetary relief would be disastrous to the economy in the long run. The argument was a failure. After all, when the economy is already in tatters, the future is meaningless. Hoover's legacy would be resigned to failure. Democrats were able to coin many terms based solely on opinions of Herbert Hoover, such as a Hoover blanket, which was old newspaper used as blanketing, a Hoover flag, which is empty pockets turned inside out, and Hoover leather, which was cardboard used to line a shoe once the sole wore through. A Hoover wagon was an automobile with horses hitched to it, often with the engine removed because they couldn't afford fuel. The most famous of these terms, of course, was the Hooverville, the name generally applied to any shantytown that appeared in the early stages of the Depression. Present in nearly every city in the nation, the largest Hooverville was located in St. Louis. Some 3,000 to 5,000 people lived in the area. They elected their own mayor, a man named Gus Smith, who allegedly was the first to build a shack on the site. It was actually one of the few fully integrated sites within the city, although it did have 4 distinct racial districts. Perhaps the brightest product of the St. Louis Hooverville was a location called Ruth's Haven, which was the brainchild of a 16-year-old high schooler and functioned as a community center for the Hooverville. The city proper was ultimately apathetic to the homeless living in the Hooverville, the mayor at the time declaring that he, quote, had no authority to do anything for the unemployed, end quote. He stood by those words. Several songs would reference Hoovervilles by name. It's Hard Time by Joe Stone would be one of the first.
It is hard time, yeah, hard time everyone. It is hard time, yeah, hard time everyone. And it's hard time, yeah, baby, it's hard time everyone.
Beans, Bacon, and Gravy was another song that came from the early days of the Depression.
I was born long ago in 1894. I've seen many a panic, I will own. I've been hungry, I've been cold, and now I'm growing old. But the worst I've seen was 1931. Oh, those beans, bacon, and gravy, they almost drive me crazy. I eat them till I see them in my dreams. When I wake up each morning and another day is dawning, I know I'll have another mess of beans.
Following Roosevelt's election in 1932, in which he trounced Hoover across the nation, the economy cautiously began to recover. The Depression would not cease without a fight, however, and in 1934, the first wave of what would become the Dust Bowl began. Unsustainable farming practices, coupled with major changes in the supply and demand of staple crops throughout the region, produced conditions for catastrophe. A brutal drought in the early 30s turned the topsoil to powder, and on November 11th, 1933, the first of a series of major haboobs that year tore through South Dakota. The storms would occur intermittently across the following 2 years. April 14th, 1935, would define the event. 20 different haboobs would tear across the Great Plains. The day would be known as Black Sunday. The Little Apocalypse would prove to be the most defining portrait of the Great Depression. Much of the music of the late 30s was directly influenced by the Dust Bowl. Woody Guthrie's album Dust Bowl Ballads was made up of songs he learned while traveling with migrant farmers during the Dust Bowl. He gained the nickname Dust Bowl Troubadour in these travels. Many of these Okies, as they were called, given that Oklahoma was one of the hardest struck states, sought California as their refuge. Many of these migrants would discover upon arrival to California that due to the Depression, the economic standing there was not all terribly better from the economic standing they had left behind. Guthrie would sing about this in his song Do Re Mi.
Thousands of folks back east, they say, leaving home every day, beating a hot and dusty way to the California line. Across the desert sand they roll, trying to get out of the old Dust Bowl. They think they're coming to a sugar bowl, and here's what they find. The police at the port of entry say, you're number 14,000 for today. Oh, if you ain't got the do-re-mi, folks, you ain't got the do-re-mi. Better hang on in beautiful Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Georgia, Tennessee. California is a garden of Eden, a paradise to live in or see. But believe it or not, you won't find it so hot if you ain't got the do-re-mi.
The Dust Bowl would not end so much as fade away. The generally accepted end is in the year 1940, when the last of the haboobs hit, and the Great Depression also began to fade. The United States' formal entry into World War II in late 41 would cement this ending. It was around this time that Woody Guthrie wrote his most famous song. Kate Smith's rendition of God Bless America was on airwaves across the countries in the late 1930s. Guthrie had traveled with thousands of Okies to California in the worst of the Dust Bowl. He had seen the catastrophe of the Great Depression firsthand. He hated God Bless America. He thought it was a jingoistic and exclusive song. In 1940, he scribbled the first draft of God Blessed America from Me, which would later develop into This Land Is Your Land. This first draft made no effort to hide Guthrie's opinions. In 1940, he was still in his anti-war phase. 2 verses were included that were ultimately cut from the earliest recording of the song.
There was a big high wall there that tried to stop me. Sign was painted, said private property, but on the back side it didn't say nothing. This land was made for you and me. When the sun comes shining, then I was strolling, and the wheat fields waving, and the dust clouds rolling. My voice was chanting as the fog was lifting. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land, and this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me.
There are a few possible reasons for why these verses weren't included. When Guthrie first recorded the song in 1944, he had entered a decidedly pro-America stance, given the United States' involvement in the war. Though some have said that the 2 verses were cut against Guthrie's wishes, because the song would have never made it over the airwaves otherwise. Recordings of Guthrie singing the omitted verses do exist, however. You just heard one. A year after Guthrie recorded God Bless America, the sun was recreated in New Mexico.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. quoted the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
The success of the Manhattan Project and subsequent obliteration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked a definitive beginning for a new global era. I will not debate whether or not the use of the bombs was morally justified, because whether it was or was not, the bombs were dropped all the same, and we must now live with that reality. The revelation of the atom bomb, the sun weaponized, produced a natural anxiety in the American people. This anxiety grew exponentially when the Soviet Union successfully tested a nuclear bomb in 1949. As the wartime alliance between the USSR and the United States rapidly deteriorated as anti-communist sentiment bubbled up through America, the idea of a nuclear war began to look less like fiction. The most famous song about the new weapon was Old Man Atom.
I'm gonna preach you a sermon about old man Adam. Now, I don't mean the Adam in the Bible, Datum. No, I don't mean the Adam Mother Eve made it. I mean that thing that science liberated. You know, Einstein said he was scared. If he's scared, boy, I'm scared. You know, life used to be such a simple joy. The cyclotron was a super toy. Folks got born, they'd work and marry, and atom was a word in the dictionary. Then it happened. These science guys from every clime, they all pitched in with overtime. Before you knew it, the job was done. They'd hitched up the power of the doggone sun, put a harness on old Sol, splitting atoms right and left, while the diplomats were splitting hairs.
The post-war world was unfortunately not more peaceful than the world before it. In fact, over the next few decades, America would soon find itself embroiled in proxy war after proxy war, the most defining of which happened across the Pacific Ocean in a former French colony.
But the Atoms International, in spite of hysteria, flourishes in Utah, also Siberia. The atom don't care about politics or who got what into whichever fix. All he wants to do is sit around and have his nucleus bombarded by neutrons.